It's natural, when reading an old book, to romanticize the past, to fall in love with another period of time. In fact, I think we should encourage those feelings, but only to an extent. Because while we might love the Bronze Age and the depiction of the Bronze Age and the beautiful material culture of the Odyssey, we should also pay attention to the Iron Age and how it seeps in through the cracks of this story. Because try as the author might, he can't completely ignore the ugliness of his own era, the Greek Dark Ages, the early Iron Age, when civilization collapsed, when the population decreased by a factor of 3 over the entire Peloponnesian subcontinent of Greece. This lets us into an era of tragedy, and at this point, we should no longer fall in love, but instead turn to realism, to pragmatism, to help us understand what's happening in Book 15. Gray Miles, welcome to Odyssey Book 15. Come on the journey with me. The Odyssey has the status of myth. We've been exploring this book as an opportunity to step into the past, to step into the minds, into the bodies, and into the world of an era that has moved on. Myth is an opportunity to be other than ourselves. But this week, we're going to be discussing the way in which the Odyssey is a glimpse into a darker world than our own. A world marked by profound differences in inequality of gender roles, in random violence, without any kind of justice system to police it or mitigate the effects. This is chapter 15, a book about the Iron Age as an age of destruction, as an age in which the creativity and the flourishing of the Bronze Age has become diminished, has withered, and has resulted in a kind of whole-scale social breakdown. Now, the Odyssey is a story about a vanished golden age, an age of heroes. But it nonetheless is situated in a time of violence, of recrimination, of vengeance. And the uglier parts of human nature are still evident in this story. This ugliness has been sublimated in our own culture. We avoid it, right? We try to control it, right? But we know by watching the media, by seeing stories of other cultures, that it persists among human beings around the world. Evil walks among us. Make no mistake. And Book 15 is about that. We see murderers on the run, right? We hear stories of rape, right? Of enslavement. Sexual slavery occurs in Book 15. These kinds of things we have dedicated our own cultures to eliminating, right? But it persists around the world. And when we look at more unfortunate countries where social devolution has happened, we should, in that case, have a glimpse of the Bronze Age collapsing into the early Iron Age of ancient Greece. The opening of Book 15 finds Telemachus still entwined in relationships with these older, more powerful men. One of the problems with a warrior culture, right, is that even when allies come together, they seek dominance over one another. So instead of just being equal friends with each other, the dominant male seeks to control the movement and the resource accesses of the submissive male, right? So that's part of the problem of a dominance-based culture. Now, we know that Bronze Age Greece had more social avenues for women, for slaves, for artisans who created beautiful material objects, exquisite even, right? But that when ancient Greece descended into the Bronze Age, it reverted back to a more dominant, submission-based warrior culture in which exclusion and control of others was a precept of the basic social dynamic underlying the entire world of the ancient Greeks, right? So first of all, Athena begins the chapter by saying Penelope, who's a byword for loyalty. Can you imagine a more loyal wife? She's been waiting for 20 years. What is that, right? And Athena starts off by saying, you better hurry back and make sure your mother isn't giving away her favors, right, to one of the suitors. That's disgusting, right? So right away, the book opens with a sort of an ugly, misogynistic stereotype of women as being unable to control their own sexuality, right? And as being dangerous in this respect. And Athena, who is sort of speaking for the culture in this moment as a goddess, says, hurry home and protect, your material objects, Telemachus, from your mother giving them away to one of the suitors. So after all we've seen of Penelope, this is a slap in the face for her. And this is why I'm saying this book, Book 15, is really an exploration of the ugliness of an entire society degenerating, right, into a much uglier and less complex form than before this, right? Now, Telemachus has to cope with these older, wealthier, more powerful, more established males who seek to dominate him through the uses of hospitality. Has anyone ever given you a gift in such a way that you didn't feel you could accept it because it left you too much in gratitude towards them? Well, in this book, we see Nestor and Menelaus seeking to control Telemachus by being overly generous, by showering him with gifts, by, in Menelaus' case, running him down while he's on his horse to give him such an extravagant gift that there's no way he could ever repay it back, except through servitude, right? Except through humbling himself before this dominant male that seeks to dominate him, right? Like some brutal version of a mountain gorilla, right? It's unconscionable. But yet we see this at every level of Book 15. Because the next moment, as Telemachus prepares to evade King Nestor, right, so as to avoid being too much into his debt, he actually has to manipulate Nestor's own son to let him escape. He turns son against father, right, in this moment. And this is all because Nestor will seek to control Telemachus as the kind of younger male by saying, no, you must come back home with me while I shower you with more gifts, right? To prove my dominance, my authority, my legitimacy as a king, right? We would find this behavior repellent, right? Revolting and repulsive on many levels. And yet this is how the society was organized. So even though the Odyssey is a book about the glorious Bronze Age, the age of heroes like Odysseus, it's also showing us a window into the ugly Iron Age of when it was written. So Telemachus encounters a murderer who is careful to say that he is also a prophet, right, in the description of Theoclymenus. And he tells Telemachus, the son of Odysseus, a harrowing story of how he murdered a man and had to go on the run, right? And the author is careful to include a number of details which illustrate just how fragile and how vulnerable a society he was coming from, right? This is a culture reflected in this story where there is very little to prevent total social breakdown in the form of brutal violence, right? There's no police force, there's no military, and there's no social rules really governing or guiding this. This is a state of Hobbesian nature, right? Where life is nasty, brutal, and short, right? Before we encounter Theoclymenus, Helen, the great Helen, interprets a omen right, of an eagle sweeping down from the mountain and clutching a tame goose in its claws. Again, this is a reflection of the ancient principle of lex talionsis. That is the law of the talon, right? Which means, in Latin, the law of force, okay, of brutality. How is law enforced? It is through vengeance, through the commission of acts of violence. And in this prophecy, Helen foresees that Odysseus will return home and murder the suitors who threatened his livelihood. But the point here is to see that in all of these stories, we can identify ways in which social breakdown is thorough and complete. This is the zombie apocalypse hidden inside the Odyssey, right? A time in which there were no more rules protecting us and preventing cruelty from being the way in which power was meted out and exerted, right? So Theoclymenus is a prophet, right? Meaning he can kind of see the future, or he can see omens that will indicate part of the future. He's a homeless person who throws himself at Telemachus's mercy and is granted mercy. And he's also a contemporary of Telemachus, right? Which is to say, he's a young man, no longer a part of the great age of heroes. That this book is looking into the past at the age of Odysseus and showing us a glimpse of the future. And I'll be honest with you, the future does not look pretty from this perspective. The past is glorious. The past is a time of wealth, of plenty, of heroism. The future? It's a time of darkness, right? A time of vengeance and a time of brutality, when the best instincts of humankind are snuffed out and the worst are allowed to flourish, even encouraged to come forth. Our story returns, right, as Telemachus sets sail, trying to sail past the trap that the suitors have laid for him, the naval ambush, right? They're hiding inside or on the exterior of the Needle Islands. And all of these images and all of these ideas are super relevant for what Book 15 is telling us, right? You have an ambush. Remember that anthropologists of violence will tell you that violence doesn't emerge from some sort of classic cowboy duel, right? Or two, a hero and a villain, sword fighting, right? One-on-one. No, violence is most common as opportunistic, right? As an ambush, as taking advantage of vulnerability, right? So we should pay attention to this part of the story. It's saying the suitors aren't trying to have some sort of honorable duel with Telemachus. They want to sneak up and stab him in the back, because that's how you reduce your own risk, right? That's how you maximize your own opportunities to seize whatever resources he might have, right? It's by sneaking up behind him, right, and murdering him in cold blood. So this is the kind of violence that went throughout the Iron Age, right? This was no longer an era of heroes and armies dueling on an equal plane. This was the time of sneaking around in the shadows, right? All the time, prowling around in the dark, dedicated, right? And so this is what this book is trying to tell us. So you have Telemachus trying to slip through the net, right, on the ocean where the suitors are awaiting for him, and you have Odysseus, who is in the cave of his most loyal servant, the one who loves him the most. The story turns back to Ithaca, and we find Odysseus in the swineherd's hut with Eumaeus, this one of the few truly noble characters in this entire book, right? He's a man characterized by the warmth of his heart, the generosity of his spirit, and this is one of those moments where we see Odysseus almost as an anti-hero, because he lies to his loyal servant, whose heart is clearly in the right place, and he tests him manipulatively by saying, Eumaeus, you know, I'm a homeless beggar. Meanwhile, he hasn't even shown himself as to who he is. He's pretending to be a beggar, and he says to him, I'm going to go throw myself at the mercy of the suitors, right? Because I've imposed upon your hospitality too much. And he wants to see if Eumaeus will protest, right? If he'll say no. And of course he does, because this man says, no, don't do that. They'll murder you, they'll kill you. They don't like old, ugly, homeless beggars like you. They like their servants to be dressed in finery, like proud young men, strutting around like swans, right? You're a filthy, ugly old pigeon, a vulture, right? And he wants to protect this homeless beggar who he doesn't even know. And in this moment, we see Odysseus as kind of part of this age of mistrust and fear of the other, right? And Eumaeus is belonging to a previous social order in which social trust was a part of human life, where you could rely on people to do what they say. And yet, in the next instant, Eumaeus tells us a dark and disturbing story of how he became enslaved as a child. Coming up next. So the story finds us once again in the swineherd's hut, there on the island of Ithaca, an intimate tete-a-tete between Odysseus and his most loyal servant, Eumaeus the swineherd, right? And in this moment, Eumaeus still doesn't know who his master is. He's still in disguise. And Odysseus coaxes forth this tragic story of how Eumaeus the swineherd became enslaved to Odysseus' father Laertes and to Odysseus' household in general. And once again in this story we see the ugliness of Iron Age culture. Eumaeus calls his own mother a whore, essentially, right? He says that she was suspect, that she was convinced away from her proper duties by the prospect of sex and money, right? That these wealthy traders who were tricksters from Phoenicia came to Sicily, to Ortygia, and they carried her off through trickery, right? After illicit affairs. And she took him, her young son Eumaeus, with them on board this ship. And this is an indication of how, in this time, in a warrior culture, women were seen as a threat, right? And as a commodity, right? So instead of these more complex and nuanced portraits of women that we saw earlier in the Odyssey, right? These powerful women who display emotional vulnerability and complexity, now we're returning to a kind of earlier notion, a more primitive, an angrier, an uglier concept of femininity, right? That is enforced and told by men, that women are whores, right? Or they are dutiful wives, but nothing in between, right? And this, once again, it depicts how the Iron Age and the Greek Dark Ages is a degeneration of culture, and it kind of seeps in through the cracks of this story, right? Because Homer is trying to tell us of a bygone era. He's trying to, we are Iron Age Greeks, right? Living in a primitive culture. And Homer wants to carry us to a bygone era. He wants to allow us to fantasize about a more beautiful period in history. And yet, because we are still in the Iron Age, this means that we kind of keep reverting back, even as he shows us this beautiful imagery, right, of this incredible age of heroes, and yet we keep slipping back to the present, and the sadness, the ugliness, and the cruelty of the present